Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to um, Trauma and Race Part 2, it should say, right? Um, Brought to you by Pima County Justice Services and the Safety and Justice Challenge. Thank you for taking time out of your Friday, and I will turn it over to Dr. Holt.
Dr. Holt, I think you're muted.
All right, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, good stuff. All right, so again, thank you guys for coming back to our part 2 session of race and trauma, or race-based trauma. So I hope that last weekend, last Friday was really informative and educational, but more importantly, more transformational. So today we'll be coming back dealing with the part 2 of our trauma training. So again, we are very thankful for the Pima County Justice Services, and we are thankful most definitely for the Safety and Justice Challenge through the MacArthur Foundation. So again, thank you so kindly for allowing us to have this kind of training, because it is very relevant, most definitely very necessary. My name is Dr. Holt. I am a traumatologist and a trauma crisis specialist. And so I specialize in kind of almost like every area of trauma, from acute trauma, chronic trauma, complex trauma, relational trauma, historical trauma, generational trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder known as PTSD, and you name it, of everything in the middle. And so we'll be coming again with part 2. So last week I did kind of like a foundation of racial trauma. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to be going more deeper into other areas of kind of like the manifestations of these type of race-based traumas on part 2, since I laid a lot of the groundbreaking work of racial trauma, dealing with defining racism and all the different types of racism. So I won't go into that in this trauma. So hopefully you took note on last week to get some of that groundbreaking foundational truths in regards to racial trauma. So today it'll be part 2, going deeper into some of the more of the different manifestations that we know as the result of race-based trauma. And so one of those things is going to be historical trauma. And so that's very important, because when we hear historical, what does it mean, Dr. Holt, historical trauma? Historical trauma is a multi-generational trauma that is really anchored in minority groups or communities of color. And really, when we mean by historical trauma, we're simply suggesting that it is a trauma that has historically associate themselves with different minority groups. Okay, and so when we talk about slavery and we talk about Jim Crow, we know that's really associated with African slaves and African Americans going back to the 1600s. When we talk about border issues and talk about separations of family and detention centers, we know that is associated with our Latinx, Hispanic groups. We talk about our Native Americans who've lost lands and have their culture and language have been drastically impacted. We're talking about our Native Americans. And when we talk about the Holocaust, of what has happened to our Jewish community, we understand that still impacts historically our Jewish Americans. And we also seeing an increase, again, as I alluded to on last week, we're also seeing where our Asian brothers and sisters, our Asian Americans, is also being impacted historically as well. And so that's what we mean by historical trauma. So when you hear that term, just think about specific traumas that is associated to communities of color, indigenous, or minority groups. Okay, and so one of those things we talked about since I did a lot of groundbreaking on spending a lot of time dealing with different type of components of racism, from structural and institutional systemic types of racism, internalized racism, interpersonal. So I spent a lot of time doing that on last week. So I won't do that on this session, because I believe the ground has been pretty much fortified. But I can go into these extra layers of racism and how that has been traumatizing to Americans, in particular minority groups and communities of color, individuals of color. And one of those things is, I don't think that we really understand that many Americans, one of their big instances of dealing with racism, before you even deal with police and before you deal with other aspects of racism, a lot of it comes from the education system. And that's not just students, that's just not adolescents. We also talk about really, really young children, even though I would say experiences of racial bias in early childhood education. And so this is going to be important, because we understand that the data is there, is that if individuals, especially children, are not studying in books, we know we will have to put them behind bars. The reason why we have high incarceration rates is because of the lack of education. If we don't get education, many members of the communities of color, specifically, especially African Americans, are going to be incarceration. So when we talk about structural racism and dealing with education, so structural racism is the historical and ongoing racial discrimination and segregation of African American and Black in particular, which is typically instigated or sanctioned by government. Structural racism creates inequality in every aspect of life. And so I'm going to be talking about what do we see when we say racial bias or racism anchored in education or school. That's going to be huge, because if our equality and equity is not there, it's drastically going to impact students of color, and experiencing that at a very young age, where key brain development is crucial and important. That's going to play a major part on hypervigilant and hypersensitive kids, which means like a lot of kids, a lot of students of color are more hypersensitive and hypervigilant because of their unfair treatment based on how they look or their skin color, how they're treated, or the bias or the low expectations. So we do know that racism in school goes way back, and it is still intrusive. And when children feel treated different based on their skin color or based on their culture difference, that has a great impact on the brain, not including other things that you may be going through, okay? And we know that COVID has had an extra layer of exacerbating all of the pre-existing conditions that we were already seeing that had something to do with race-based trauma. How racism can affect child development, that is very important. And so, just as I had talked about before, is that we've seen the studies show that when children's stress response systems remain activated at high levels of long periods of time, it can have significant wear and tear effect on the development of the brain or other biological systems. This can have lifelong effects on learning, behavior, in both physical and mental health. So it's one thing to look at trauma generally, and I believe I've talked about this, teach this all the time, that trauma is two things. It's a stress that is so difficult for you to cope with, but it's also this psychological, emotional wound and injury to the brain. Now that's generally. So now add hate crimes, add race-based bullying, add microaggressions to that trauma, and it's like it's a whole extra layer. So now you kind of get this picture why African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans and Native American students have this extra layer of being hypervigilant and on high alert because of the fact that they never really get a time off of dealing with systemic and institutional and structural racism. All of these layers keeps the brain on high alert. And so, which I'll go into later on, that neurobiological response is crucial, and that's the response. You got all this cortisol, you have all this stress, and the limbic system of the lower part of the brain is constantly on high alert and on fire, which eventually, long term, begins to not only affect the individual who is traumatized and race-based traumatized, in the brain and in the mind, but it also impacts your nervous system. It also impacts your physical, your physiology, your physical aspects of yourself. So that's going to be very, very important to understand that. How does race-based trauma affect child development? Another reason why it impacts child development, because especially if we talk about very, very young ages when the brain development is crucial and it's very necessary, we do brain development. So race-based trauma, most definitely, experiencing racism and racial bias at such a young age, most definitely has some type of neurological and biological impact. So we do see that racism isn't anchored in education, and it does make kids feel some kind of way. And if kids are on high alert because they don't feel safe, then it impacts cognitive capacities in the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex, and it also impacts executive functioning, which all of those major things are going to be key for academic performance, as far as, do you have reading and language delays and all of those different things. And then we also know that kids, in regards to not just in the classroom, but what does racial bias look like for students into discipline? And we do know that when it comes to students of color, African Americans, Latino students will be suspended or expelled 3 to 6 times more than their white counterparts that they go to school with. And so that opens the door to what we call the school to prison pipeline, where also we're seeing a lot of poor children and students of color that is arrested from the schoolhouse and incarcerated into the jailhouse. So they're arrested from school and they're thrown into the juvenile detention center. And kids should be at home. Now, if they're in extreme danger and threat to society, that's a different conversation. But what we were seeing in school is that there was an overly criminalization of kids. And if they were poor and if they were African American, Latino, or Native American, we saw that students of color were criminalized in school at higher rates than their white counterparts. In other words, let me give you an example. Kids that broke school policy should be consequenced through the student code of conduct. But what we were seeing is that educators, when they looked at students of color, they were looked at to be more aggressive and treated differently, and they were weaponizing the school resource officers to arrest these kiddos and throw them into the juvenile detention center. So this is what we were saying. We're talking about the school to prison pipeline. And when we saw that when they were poor and they're African American, Latino, Native American, they had a higher chance of being thrown to the detention center. And so that's very important. Also, what we saw when we talk about racial bias and racism is that kids of color were more likely, if they didn't perform or they were given extremely unequitable low expectations, they also had higher chances to just be thrown into special ed. Because a lot of times with trauma also impacts behavior. And one thing about trauma that I would say as a traumatologist is that trauma can mask different disorders and different illnesses. And so until you really understand what trauma is to that individual and how it has impacted, it's easy for us to misdiagnose kids. And so what we're also seeing is that if you were a poor child or poor student or student of color, you also had a higher chance of being misdiagnosed to have all of this ADD, ADHD. And don't get me wrong, we do have legitimate cases in regards to those disorders. But we just saw a just higher levels of overly medicating kids, overly misdiagnosing kids, and just handing out disorders and illnesses without really understanding trauma. And when you understand trauma, trauma can impact the anterior cortex of the brain, that helps regulate behaviors. Well, if you can't regulate behavior and you're dysregulated, well, your behavior can really be sporadic, and it's easy for us to misdiagnose you with an ADHD or ADD because you just can't sit down, and you can't pay attention. Well, that has a lot to do with compromising executive functioning as well when it comes to trauma. So if we really don't slow down and look at what trauma is doing, we can exacerbate the issue to be worse. And so that's what it looks like. I'll come back to that slide because I want to make equitable pitch kind of like at the end. But let's skip over to not only racism impacting education, but how does racism impact our healthcare and our community in regards to healthcare? And most definitely, it is very traumatizing when people are ill and people have chronic disease and they cannot get the help that they need. Offering people health care and giving them access to health care is two different things. And so what we see is a lot of people think because we offer health care to poor communities and we offer health care to communities of color, we think that sounds good. And it sounds good and it looks good on paper. But the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, until we can shift from offering health care to poor Americans and Americans of color to shifting it to having access to health care, we're still going to have these inequities in regards to helping people of color in our communities to get the physical and the mental help that they need. And so what we have to do is dismantle racism in our healthcare and our education system. So it's not just in education, but we do know that a lot of people are really traumatized and have high levels of trauma when they can't get the help that they need. Again, it just creates the brain to just constantly be on high alert. And I know a lot of times we think about racism, again, I think we talk a lot about the microaggressions and the interpersonal racism, but what about the hidden racism that is a system? That is a system that is in place on purpose. I hear people say it's a broken system. It's not a broken system because the system is systemically and strategically have been put in place to marginalize, disenfranchise, and stigmatize poor people and communities of color over and over and time again. And this is the reason why we go into poor communities and we go into communities of color and they're more sicker. Why are they more sicker? Because they're more stressed. They're more stressed. They live in poverty. They got communities that's full of violence, full of crime. These are the same communities that get more policing than get more resources. So yeah, you create this perfect storm in poor communities and communities of color to just be traumatized. And when you don't feel safe, when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, and you can't go to the doctor, and you got high blood pressure, you got high blood sugar known as type 2 diabetes or insulin resistant, and you got heart disease, and you can't get the help that you need, it impacts your stress levels to be extremely higher. And this is, again, where we talk about chronic stress and trauma, and when it's race-based, because people have strategically put racist and racial bias and discriminatory practices, policies, and legislation in place to disenfranchise people of color and poor people in our community. This is what we get even in our healthcare system. And so we know that women of color, African American women, African American pregnant women at that, has drastically been impacted. We also see when it versus our counterparts, we see there's a big difference in the orange. The orange symbolizes worse, okay? The worst outcomes with people of color in our community. And we see that African Americans is 19, Indian and Alaska natives are 17, Latino, Hispanic community is 14, Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders are 8, Asians are 3, African Americans really high. So African Americans, Native, and Hispanics are the highest when it comes to that, dealing with equitable health care, not just being offered health care, but opportunities. And there's a big difference of being offered health care and actually have a real opportunity and access. And until we began to address those ramifications of racial bias, even in our healthcare system, bringing equitable opportunities to the African American, Latino, and the Native American community, is going to constantly create extra stress. So we have to hack racism in our healthcare system. When we also talk about sickness and COVID hospitalization and death rates, there's no secret that the Latino and the African American community took the greatest hit when it comes to the mortality rate, comes to the hospitalization rate. African Americans, Black and Brown communities, and poor communities took the greatest hit when it comes to being impacted by the COVID-19 virus, whether it was in infection rates or death rates. So we have to do something about that. No matter where you go, pretty much the data is the same. Even looking at a different data sheet through CDC, we saw that Natives, Black Americans, and Latino Americans, again, had the highest impact when it came to being impacted by the virus. But we also have to look at how does racial bias plays on the access to real mental health and access to mental health professions. We know that between 16 and 17%, we see that individuals have some type of mental illness. African Americans make up 13%. In our population, and over 7 million perhaps have mental illness issues. So we have to look at what do we do about access to getting the mental health support that they need. Racial disparities in mental health treatment groups report feeling that they would have received better mental health care if they were a different race or ethnicity. And we saw that 15% of African Americans felt that way, 13% of Latinos felt that way, and 11% of Asian Americans felt that way. They felt pretty much that if they were white, would their outcomes be better? Would they be treated differently when it comes to seeking after mental health support? And 50% of Blacks said yes, 13% of Latinos said yes, and Asian Americans, 11% said yeah. So even when we talk about racial bias, again, why am I showing you all of this? Because I'm trying to show you when we talk about racial bias and racism, we really a lot talk about the interpersonal racism, but not the systemic racism, not the institutional racism. And this is what I'm showing you now. I'm showing you that racism is more than a racial slur. It's more than saying the N-word. It's more than being derogatory based on skin color and texture of hair and microaggressions and condescending statements. Those are kind of like all from the interpersonal part of racism. But what Dr. Holt is showing is that racism is way bigger than just interpersonal with one person to another. It's this system. It's this systemic system. It's this structural manifestation to marginalize and stigmatize people through policy and practices and legislation. This is what I'm showing you that is bigger than that. And this is the reason why we're always behind trying to catch up with dealing with racism, because racism is not just person to person. It is systemic. It is a system. It is a structure, and it is certainly institutional. And this is the reason why we have to keep our eye on it. And so depression is higher. You think about it. If you're in poverty, think about your communities filled with violence. Think about your communities are overly policed. Think about being pulled over, being Black in a traffic stop. You're being pulled over, being Black or brown. You could be killed in a traffic stop. Yeah, it gets you into this place of feeling the community of colors feeling hyper vigilant. And depression is impacted. Anxiety is impacted. Yeah, so you get pulled over by a police officer, or a police officer just trails you for miles, get behind you and just running your tags and just almost like antagonizing you. You do feel this this neurobiological change. You do feel this level of anxiety, even if your license is valid, even though you have insurance, even though you don't have any tickets out there, even though you don't have any warrants out there. Some people, based on the toxic relationships that has been developed between police and communities of color, have created this tension to where people not only get around officers in uniform, they're not comfortable. And they should feel safe because they should be guardians of the community. But sometimes that's not always so when a lot of violations have taken place in poor communities and communities of color. We also see, ladies and gentlemen, that racial bias and racism in the workplace. And what we see is that what my grandmother were fighting for 50 and 60 years ago, we're still fighting for today. And so have we gotten some strides dealing with discrimination? Yes. Have we gotten some process in dealing with racial bias? I would say in some levels, yes. But do we still have a whole lot of work to do? And I would say certainly yes. We still have a lot of work to do. And so employment discrimination is still something that we're still dealing with today, okay? And so we know that 1 in 3 people in the U.S. experience some type of race discrimination in the workplace. Hiring process bias, which means that job seekers with white sounding names are more likely to get a call back than their applicants with more ethnic sounding names, even if their qualifications are identical. Wow, that's huge, ladies and gentlemen. Let me say that again. Job seekers with white sounding names are more likely to get a call back than applicants with more ethnic sounding name, even if their qualifications are identical. So what we're seeing in race discrimination, so discrimination is not as blunt like it used to be about 50 years ago to 100 years ago, where they just blatantly say, hey, you black, we don't want anybody of color in our office. We don't want anybody of color in our circle. We don't want anybody in color in executive positions. And if we do give you a position, if you're black and brown, we're gonna give you entry level position, even though you have the same degree as Bob does. And so what it's saying is, if you have a name more like a Jose Gonzalez or a Tyrone Johnson, which sounds very ethnic, that they're probably not going to get the job opportunity or interview like a John Smith or like a Bob Williams, okay? So if it doesn't sound so ethnic, we know that this is the reason why some people have not even used their ethnic name sometimes in their for interviews in their resume, because they know that if it sounds very ethnic, and if this is a place that really do not allow opportunities for employees of color to get into that space, they won't get the opportunity. And that is very, very a big thing today. And so when I talk about discrimination, it's a little bit more covert now because there's a lot of legal protections for employees. So people who have those racist ideologies and bias towards African Americans and people of color and women sometimes will try to covertly work behind the scenes to exclude people. So this is a big thing in regards to racial discrimination. And this is traumatizing, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, it is very stressful to where if you feel like you're a person of color, you got to work 3 times harder than the average white American. And in some spaces, it is very true. Again, have we made some progress dealing with racial discrimination? I believe in some aspects, yes. But do we still have those elements of racism and racial bias and misogynistic ways and sexism and all of that going on and racism going on? And I would tell you yes. But the fact of the matter is, it's a lot of stress on the brain to constantly be overly thinking, are you good enough, when you have the exact or sometimes even more education and training and skill than the average white colleague, and the average white colleague is constantly being approached for promotion and elevation, and here you are still not going anywhere or not even getting the job at all. So when we talk about that, we still are impacted mentally and emotionally. It does something emotionally to you when you feel like your qualifications and your skill sets are not good enough, okay? So think about that. So we also talk about not just racism in the job market and in employment, but in the American criminal justice system, okay? And this is huge because we know that this country really do too much on incarcerating people, period. And I'll come back to that. But let me look at, I want to hit this part first as well, is dealing with the wealth gap between whites and blacks American. And this is why I talk about how trauma and race is connected, and how the brain is impacted when you just treat it different. And you're constantly working hard and you push 2 steps back. And so we also know that when we talk about racism and racial trauma, that it is very traumatizing to even look at the wealth gap between just the African American. You know, the African American wealth is 13,000 versus the white 150,000. I mean, look at some other stats. Some say 117,000 for our white citizens and 17,000 for the black. But I think you kind of get where I'm going when we look at the wealth gap. And this is huge, ladies and gentlemen. And why am I bringing this up? Because, again, we're not talking about interpersonal racism and racial bias. We're talking about the systemic and structural racism. And one of the big reasons why we have this huge gap is because we go forward 400 years ago, when African slaves were emancipated. They were emancipated, but they wasn't given anything. The only thing we're given was freedom on paper, but they wasn't given property. They wasn't given an opportunity to get wealth. So when we look at African Americans going back all the way to 1619, and then we go back to the 1800s, where we have emancipation, we see that African Americans didn't get all of these different amenities and opportunities. And so we're generationally behind. Why is that? Because of Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow policies and all kind of legislation and practices that is to marginalize and disenfranchise people on a generational level. So some of that has a lot to do with that as well. And this is the reason why we talk about racism based on structure and institution is really real, and systemic racism is really real. So getting back to the American justice system, we know that Black and brown people are incarcerated more than any ethnicity in our country. We just incarcerate too many people versus our white counterparts. I think I talked about it on last week that when a Black and brown person get pulled over in a traffic stop and a white counterpart get pulled over in a traffic stop, ladies and gentlemen, we talking about two different things. Two different things, you know. Some of my white counterparts, we talk and they say, well, you know, when I get pulled over, I don't think anything of it. Get my driver's license, registration, and I'm on my way. 9 times 10 don't even get a ticket, get a warning. But African Americans and Latinos, when we get pulled over, you know, it's a life and death for us. And we feel that anxiety. We feel that hypervigilance. We feel like we're on high alert. Immediately our brain gets into this space till we feel danger instead of feeling safety. When we're around public servants who are guardians, we should be feeling safe. And in some communities, that's not so. Now, again, let me give my disclaimer. I'm not talking about all police officers, so please don't get in your feelings. That's not exact. That is not what I'm saying at all. We have some great police officers in our city. We have some great sheriff deputies in our county sheriff's department. We have some great border patrol agents. We have some great state troopers and DPS. So let me just say that. And we do have all of these officers that really takes their job serious, that really puts on that badge and that gun and that uniform, and they know they are not soldiers in the community, they are guardians in the community, and they know they are public servants, and they go above the call of service every single shift to make sure that their community is safe. So we salute those type of police officers. But what I am talking about is bad behavior. And what I am talking about is bad apples on the force. And sometimes those bad behaviors is a negative shadow on the whole agency, and that's not always fair, because you got a few bad apples out there that's mistreating people and abusing people and using police brutality, can be a stain on the whole agency. And a lot of times that's what we see throughout our nation, is that a lot of people just hate all cops because of a few bad interactions with some cops, and then not all cops. But I just want to say that there are some great officers out there, and I have law enforcement in my family who I'm close with, who I grew up with, that serve Memphis Police Department out there in Tennessee, and go above the call of duty every day, putting their life on the line every day, not knowing that they come back home to their family. So we salute those great officers. But we do know that we do have a police tension problem with law enforcement and communities of color. And a lot of our communities of color have been overly policed, aggressive traffic stops, unfair treatment, and on all of that. And so a lot of that creates what we have today with racial trauma, and how the African American and Latino communities and Native American communities feel when they're around an officer. Instead of feeling safe, they feel threatened, they feel uneasy, they feel like they're a target. And we have to do better to build those community relations between law enforcement and community. But the fact of the matter is, we still have this data, and it's very, very real. And we know that African American youth are 9 times, and Latinos youth are 4 times more to be sentenced in an adult prison sentence with the same crime as a white youth. And so these are some of the disparities that we see, and we do have to work hard and get better at it. We do know that if you're African American and Latino and you are a person of color, especially if you have a nice ride and some rims and a sound system, sometimes you can be viewed as a drug dealer, or be viewed as a trafficker. And really, you're just a hard-working person of color that's working your 40 hours just like anybody else, and you happen to live in a nice neighborhood. And I do know there's some people of color that have reported and made complaints that police officers treated them different because they drove a nice car and they were driving in a nice neighborhood, and they thought that they were up to no good, and come to find out they were actually a homeowner in those good neighborhoods. And so we do still see things like that happen. So if you're a person of color, we do see that racial bias is done when you are a person of color and you're educated, you got a nice car, you got a nice home, and you live in a nice neighborhood, and you get treated like you're a criminal. And then if you live in the hood, and if you live in a crime-infested neighborhood, drug-infested neighborhood, you still pulled over and treated the same way. So it's almost like when you're a person of color, it's like dog dang if you do, danged if you don't. It's no matter what I do good, get education, live in a good neighborhood, I'm still treated a certain way. I stay in the hood and stay with crime-infested neighborhoods, I still get treated some type of way. This is traumatizing, ladies and gentlemen. This is the reason why people say Black people are angry. Yes, we are angry. This is the reason why people say, well, the Latino community are angry. Yes, they're angry because it is a very, very stressful situation, that when you get to a point that you feel that no matter what you do, whether you move forward and try to improve, or you're stagnant and stay in a regressive situation, that you're constantly picked on. And so I just want to spend some time on that. We still see in our county government with just justice system, is that African Americans represent 4 to 5% of the population, but overly represent in the county jails about 12%. Natives 4%, but still overrepresent. So we see that there's an issue. Hispanics still, even at 30 to 40% of population, still overrepresenting in the county jail. So people of color are constantly overrepresented, and we just have to do better looking at that. So saying all of that in mind, everything I talked about as far as job discrimination, racial trauma in the justice system, education system, the healthcare system, the wealth gap problem because of systemic racism and systemic racism, institutional racism, all these things that are in place to marginalize people. What is all that doing to the brain? I'm glad you asked me. Again, it is traumatizing. What is trauma? Trauma is an emotional wound to the brain and an overwhelming stress that you have a difficult time coping with. That's what trauma does. And when you are in this trauma, race-based trauma mode, the brain is on high alert, working to keep you in a high alert space to save your life. And this is the reason why we have the neurobiological response. So when you are in trauma, or in high alert, the body is doing what it's supposed to do. It is to help you, it is to help save your life out of a life-threatening situation. But when the life-threatening situation is gone and there's no longer a threat, then the body goes through this calming, and that's how it should be. But what we're seeing is people are in a traumatized state for long periods of time, much longer than short terms periods. And so that's not necessarily healthy. For the brain to constantly be in high alert, the limbic system constantly in survival mode, which impacts the prefrontal cortex of cognition and impacts the prefrontal cortex when it comes to executive functioning, impacts the amygdala, it impacts the thalamus, it impacts the hippocampus. I mean, that's not how the brain's supposed to work. And what we're seeing in communities of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Native American communities, is that we are overly stressed because of all the things I talked about, being poor, socially, economically challenged. Then some of that is generational trauma. Racial trauma can be generational trauma, which means that what my great-grandmother went through, my grandfather went through, and what my grandfather went through, my father went through, and what my father went through, I go through. What I go through, my children go through, and my grandchildren go through. So it's also this vicious cycle that creates chronic illness and disease as well, because your brain and your body is not supposed to be on high alert, and all this release of stimuli and cortisol all over and through the system of the body creates inflammation, which increased inflammation creates chronic diseases. And so until we can get the body and the brain to reconnect and get rewired for healing, we're not only impacting individuals neurologically and psychologically, but we also impacting people physiologically, which means physically, I'm just sick. And physically, I have more insulin resistance in communities of color, heart disease, and communities of color. So we have to do something to creating a place of healing for the communities of color, because when you're constantly in a flight or freeze, everything is just being impacted. It's okay for short term, but what we're seeing in our communities, especially when it's race-based and it's communities of color, we most definitely impact it. A lot of things we don't talk about in trauma is the science of epigenetics, which is what we also see is that trauma just doesn't impact the neurology, the psychology, but it also impacts the physiology to the point to where it also impacts your genes and your DNA. Wow, that's deep. So we also see that when we talk about trauma in epigenetics, is that it just doesn't even just impacts child development, but it really impacts the development, and it can alter your genes and alter your DNA. So we also have a DNA problem when we talk about trauma, especially race-based trauma. Because one of the things, I always ask myself is, what did trauma look like during slavery? What did trauma look like during the Holocaust, when Jews were experiencing massive murders and genocide in the gas chamber? What was going on in the brain of the Jewish community dealing with those things? Okay, trauma also impacts memory, your explicit memory and your implicit memory. Explicit memory is more of your conscious, intentional recollection of factual information, previous experiences and concepts. And implicit memory, a recollection acquired and used unconsciously that can affect thoughts and behavior. So this is huge, right? Because this is the reason why sometimes when we talk about race-based trauma, your memories are impacted, right? Your hippocampus have time-stamped every racist interaction you have had. This is why it's triggering when someone uses a racial slur, or when someone uses a microaggression, or if someone burned a cross through the Ku Klux Klan through in your front yard, or some person you've heard of a lynching of a person of color, or being hung, or hearing your grandparents talk about how members of their family and your ancestors have been hung or been victims of hate crimes. This impacts the memory, ladies and gentlemen. It is very, very true. It's very, very triggering. And one out of the different types of memory it impacts your episodic memory, and it impacts your emotional memory. And this is why, even though another thing about trauma, especially race-based trauma, is that you don't have to be the actual one that experienced the trauma, because the brain is still impacted when you hear the horrific stories. The horrific stories of people who have been victims of hate crimes, and victims of racism, and victims of Jim Crow laws, and all of those things. That has an impact if you keep hearing these stories over and over and over. Because one thing, again, when we talk about trauma, we talk about the 3 E's: the experience, the exposure, and the actual event. Well, that's not always mean that you have to experience the event. Perhaps you can be exposed to other people's trauma enough that it still impacts you by hearing about those stories. So what is trauma doing to the brain? What is racial trauma doing to the brain? Well, remember, trauma impacts the brain. It rewires the brain. But in the early stages of development, what we see in a child's brain when they've been exposed to a lot of violence and exposed to a lot of trauma, we see the abused brain looks different from the healthy brain. We see on the healthy brain on the left that it's lit up, it's stimulated. There's a lot of active brain cells and neurotransmitters doing their thing like they should. But when we see on the abused side of the brain, we see a lot of missing tissue. We see a lot of underdevelopment of the brain. And this is what creates these extra issues in the future if we don't bring healing in the environment of that brain, okay? So, and this is also what racial trauma can do, especially if you've been exposed to a lot of racist acts and racial bias and microaggressions and race-based bullying at such young ages. Can trauma impacts the brain? Can race-based trauma impact the brain? And I would say, heck yes. We see that it is detrimental to the development of individuals. So let me shift a moment and get to the positive, because I'm running out of time. Can we bounce back from the setbacks of trauma? And the answer is yes. I always say that trauma may not be your fault, but certainly it is your responsibility to heal from the trauma, because if you don't heal from the trauma, you will bleed on people that didn't cut you. It is very necessary for you to be, number one, very honest about your trauma. You can't get help if you are in denial. You can't get help if you're pretending that you have not been affected. And one of the worst things we can do is tell people to be strong without getting the resources they need to heal. Because a lot of times when people think that they're being strong, but really they are really hurting themselves because they're not getting the help and the support they need, because they first got to be honest that their traumas has happened, their traumas have impacted them. And when we come to race-based trauma, yes, it does hurt to be called a racial slur. Yes, it does hurt for you to be part of a race joke, a stereotypical race joke, and people was ha-ha and then he and that do make you feel some kind of way. You don't feel safe. You do get into a place where you feel hypervigilant. You do get to the place where you can also feel anxiety. Okay, so one of the big things we want to do is talk about how do we create these healing spaces, and healing happens through relationships. Think about it. If a person is traumatized, that comes from a negative, toxic relationship. But somebody is healed, that comes from a positive relationship. So when we think about starting the healing process from race-based trauma, you got to start developing more healthy relationships, and especially relationships where you have white allies, our white brothers and sisters in the community that stands by you and also and denounce racism themselves and stand alongside you and say, hey, I see you, and hey, I understand your pain. Sometimes what we need in the African American Latino community, sometimes for people to just say, you know what you've been talking about for the last 100 years, you are telling the truth. Sometimes we just want to be told, I see you, right? I'm not saying you got to understand the whole struggle of Black and brown people, but being able to say, I see you, okay? So we have to create safe spaces. To get the brain to shift from being hypervigilant, we have to have safe spaces and loving relationships. So what does that mean? What does that look like practically, Dr. Holt? I'm glad you asked me, because I'm going to tell you. Loving relationships looks like, if we have racial bias in the education system, we got to have teachers that love kids so much that they want to build relationships with them. Relationships. One of the things I teach about in education when school districts have me to come and talk about these issues and trauma, I always say, you can't teach kids if you can't reach kids. In order to really teach kids, you got to be an excellent reacher. When I ask people, even adults that's been out of high school for 30 and 40 years, I say, who was your best teacher? And you know what they tell me? They don't tell me the teacher who was the mathematician. They don't tell me the teacher who was the master educator. They don't tell me the teacher who had phenomenal pedagogy. They tell me the teacher that was able to reach them, the one that was able to build relationships with them, the one that took the time to understand them. And that's not Care Bear stuff, ladies and gentlemen. That the science is real. What we realize is that there is something called the affection hormone or the love hormone. It's called oxytocin. And when we see that when individuals are in loving relationships and loving spaces, the oxytocin hormone is released when you get a hug, when you get a kiss, when you get this warm embrace, or if you're in a space where you feel like this person really care about you, it releases this hormone called oxytocin. So this is not just some exercise we just tell you to do because we don't have anything to do. No, there's some science behind this work, ladies and gentlemen. When we are in loving spaces, we release oxytocin. So oxytocin is important because oxytocin is important, because when we are in a toxic space, we release a stress hormone called cortisol. So when we are in stressful situations, stressful relationships, toxic relationships, abusive relationships, we release cortisol. But when we are in safe spaces of loving relationships, we release oxytocin, if that kind of makes sense. So in our justice services, in our justice systems, in our county jails, in our juvenile detention centers, in our pretrial services, in our probation, and when we need more oxytocin release than cortisol. Okay. And one of the things we do is we help people to get regulated, because a dysregulated professional cannot help a dysregulated defendant, or a dysregulated client, or a dysregulated student, or a dysregulated patient, if that makes sense. Somebody in the room has to be regulated and remain regulated. When we remain regulated, we have more control of our moods. We have more control of our behaviors. Violent acts are decreased. Threats aggression is decreased when we have regulation. So the question is, when we talk about even in the justice system, it's not so much about, because we say Department of Corrections, but a lot of our institutions are Department of Punishment, because the question is, what are we correcting? Who are we rehabilitating? Are we punishing more than we are correcting? Are we more in retribution than we are in restorative? That's the big question, but we must bring regulation. And so one of the things that helps us is meditation. Meditation is very, very helpful, especially people who have been traumatized, especially people who have been victims of racial trauma. Meditation is huge to starting the healing process, getting the brain to relax, getting the brain to feel a place of safety. And this is what meditation does. It increases blood flow, it slows the heart rate, reduces feeling of depression, anxiety, anger, and confusion. I mean, like, there's so many great benefits when it comes to meditation. It provides a sense of calm, because if you've been a victim of racial trauma and you're high alert and you're constantly on walking on eggshells in your life, you really need something to help calm that brain and get that limbic system of the brain to stop being in control and start bringing balance, or start restoring insomnia, reversing insomnia and restoring rest where you can sleep, things of that nature. Meditation is big. Get therapy. If you are a victim of trauma, we do now have trauma therapists, okay? People who specialize in being psychologists, therapists, psychotherapists, social workers, licensed counselors who are trauma informed. Get some therapy, trauma informed therapy, not just go to anybody, because everybody's not for everybody. That's another thing. You know, I have people say, well, I had tried therapy before, but it seemed like it didn't work. My therapist didn't connect. That might be so because everybody's not for everybody. You need to do your homework. You don't just let your fingers do the walking and just call any therapist up and say, hey, I need to see you. Do some research. Interview your therapist, just like they're going to interview you in consultation, and make sure that you're a good match. Psychotherapy is good. Psychotherapy is known as talk therapy, being able to talk through some things, getting you to open up. That's a great therapy. EMDR trauma therapy has been known to be effective for certain people that have trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. So you may want to deal with a therapist who specializes in that. Hypnotherapy. I'm the hypnotherapist expert as well, that does work with people with trauma and PTSD by going past the conscious mind and putting them to this hypnotic state where we go and deal with the unconscious mind and deal with some of those bad programmings that has happened to the brain when some bad things that's happening, and we recode them so that when you come out of hypnotherapy, your different outcomes would improve. So that could be something you can look into. But one of the big things when we talk about the racial traumas outside of therapy is that you still, after you walk away from your therapist, you still got to live. Still have to live in your family, still have to live in your community. So one of the big ways is we have to anchor equity as a point of creating healing for people of race-based trauma. People need equity. People need to make sure going forward that they have the opportunities to come out of what they have experienced. Dr. King said, when people are voiceless, they will take temper tantrums like a child who has not been paid attention to. And riots are massive temper tantrums from a neglected, voiceless people. Wow, that's powerful. A lot of times when people are angry because of racism and injustices, it's because they also feel they have not been heard. And so communities and communities of color are really angry because they feel like these things keep happening to them and the court systems don't hold people accountable for their racist act. Right now, we're dealing with Ahmaud Arbery trial right now. And so we're beginning to get those tensions a little high, trying to figure out, will justice be served? We don't know. But when we have our villages and our communities upset, they're not just upset because they're angry people. We are a loving, resilient people, but we get tired and sick and tired of seeing people do these acts, injustice acts and racist acts, and not held accountable. This is what I want to get to, and this is what we want. Okay. And when we look at this, is very powerful. And I look at this, when we look at the reality, which is one gets more one gets more than is needed while the other gets less than is needed. This is a huge disparity. That's the first column, the huge disparity. But then equality is the assumption is that everyone benefits from the same supports. This is considered to be equal, which we would name as equality. And even though some people get the same supports, it doesn't mean it benefit everybody. So this is where equity comes in, where everyone gets the support they need, which is to produce equity. But what we forget is we stop at equity, and I'm adding justice to it, is that we really also want justice, because all three can see the game without supports of accommodations because of the cause of the justice. The justice creates this platform where everyone can enjoy in an equitable kind of level. So Dr. King said, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Dr. King also said, love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy to a friend. And so when we're dealing with racism and racial bias and all of those things that come with that, love is the key. We talked about last week, the best powerful medicine dealing with trauma is not the antidepressant, not the psychotropic medications or psychotic medications. It's love. Love is the key. Abraham Lincoln, the late President Abraham Lincoln, said, America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and we lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. And when we allow racism to be unchecked, and when we allow racist behaviors to not be challenged and addressed in our education system, in our law enforcement communities, in our healthcare systems, in our housing market, whatever that looks like, if we allow that to happen, as according to President Lincoln, we are destroying ourselves by not checking those bad behaviors. So I close on this. One thing, no matter what we go through, is resilience. One thing I know, descendants of slaves, African slaves and slavery, our people have been resilient people. They have been able to take some lickings and keep on ticking. In our brown communities, in our Latino communities, in our Native communities, we are resilient people. And when I like looking at the picture on the left about the plant, that no matter how hard it was to press through asphalt, and we know asphalt is extremely hard and tough. This is what we drive our cars on. But the power and resilience of that plant still is so strong that one day at a time, just pushing little after a little, despite the hardship, is able to press through. And ladies and gentlemen, that's how we address racism. We know it's systemic. We know it's institutional. We know we have systems out there to marginalize and disenfranchise people of color and poor people. But the power of resistance that we have instilled in our families and instilled in our communities, and we know we still have a rough tide ahead, and we know we still have high mountains to climb, and we know that we have rough storms to endure, but the power of resilience is there. And that's what I'm proud of about being American. It's because I still dream that my next generation that my children's gonna live in can live in a better community, can live in a healthier community because of the power of resilience, because of the tenacity of people who's gonna stand up for right and stand up for justice and stand up for fairness and stand up for equity and stand up for the name of love for everybody. We are resilient people. The city of Tucson is a resilient city, a resilient community, and we are proud to work together and know that we shall overcome someday. And so I'm excited, and I want to thank you for your time, but let's keep on doing. I close on this, what Dr. King said in dealing with resilience. He said, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. He said, but whatever you do, keep moving forward. And so I just want to tell you, thank you for your time. Keep moving forward. For the race is not given to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but he that endures to the end. As a Tucson community, we're going to finish strong. Thank you so kindly for your time. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holt. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I will give folks an opportunity to ask more questions in the chat here. While we're giving folks an opportunity to post anything, any questions that you might have, I will thank Dr. Holt very much for doing the speaker series, and I'll remind folks that this is the third in our 6-part series. We've got 3 more to go. Starting 2 weeks from today, we're going to start covering trauma and incarceration. And of course, that's also with Dr. Holt, who I would like to wish a belated happy birthday to. His birthday was on Sunday, Halloween Day. So the first question I saw here in the chat, let me try and make sure I'm on the correct one. This is from Judge Surio over at Tucson City Court, who says, as you mentioned, women experience a lot of discrimination too. Have there been studies about whether gender-based discrimination results in the same type of trauma? How does that affect women of color in particular? If they face discrimination based on gender and race, are they even more affected?
Yes, so most definitely when it's trauma, the brain, see the parasympathetic nervous system picks up danger and alert, and when you feel unsafe, you still have that same kind of response. And when you are a female of color, and it's gender and it's race based, you still feel some kind of way in regards to experiencing that level of trauma. And sometimes it can be even exacerbated even more because it's dual. It's not just race, it's also gender. And a lot of women of color do feel that those type of impacts from some type of being treated different because of gender and race.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holt. I don't see any other questions, but please, we have a couple seconds left if anybody is still typing furiously into the chat box. On that note, I will say thank you again, Dr. Holt. We appreciate you doing this series with us, and we hope to see you all again on November 19th. Hope you enjoy the holiday week next week and stay safe.
All right. Thank you, guys.